My name is Karen Taylor and I am 36 years old. I never expected to open the door of my luxury beachfront home to find the family who had excluded me for 12 long years standing on my doorstep. There they were. My mother, Grace, my stepfather, Richard, my stepsister, Vanessa, and her husband, Eric, all staring at me with a mixture of awe and discomfort. I invited them in, calmly watching as their eyes widened at the marble floors and ocean views. The color drained from their faces when I said, "Before I continue with what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. While you are at it, hit that like and subscribe button so you do not miss any more true life stories about family betrayal and personal triumph." My early childhood was what many would consider picture perfect. I lived with my mother, Grace, and my father, Jeffrey, in a modest but comfortable home in the suburbs of Boston. Dad worked as an engineer for a construction company while Mom taught at the local elementary school. Our weekends were filled with trips to the park, movie nights with homemade popcorn, and Sunday dinners where Dad would grill in the backyard regardless of the weather. I remember how he would stand there in the snow during winter, spatula in hand, claiming that snow actually added flavor to the burgers. Mom would laugh and pull me close, whispering that my father was silly, but that was why we loved him. Every night before bed, Dad would tell me stories about brave little girls who grew up to change the world. He would always end with, "And one day, Karen, that will be you." I believed him with all my heart. When I brought home good grades, both my parents celebrated like I had won an Olympic medal. Dad would swing me around the kitchen while Mom prepared my favorite dessert. They made me feel like I could accomplish anything. Everything changed when I was 12 years old. Dad was driving home from work during a heavy rainstorm when a truck lost control on the highway. The police said he died instantly, which was supposed to be comforting, I guess. The funeral remains a blur in my memory, just a sea of black clothes, hushed voices, and my mother's hand squeezing mine so tightly it hurt. Mom fell apart after Dad died. She would spend days in bed barely eating, rarely speaking. I tried my best to take care of both of us, cooking simple meals, making sure I got myself to school on time, keeping the house reasonably clean. I was just a kid, though, and there were many nights when I cried myself to sleep missing Dad and feeling terrified about our future. Almost exactly 1 year after Dad's funeral, Mom introduced me to Richard. He was tall and well-dressed, with a confident smile and a booming voice that filled our quiet house. "Your mother and I have been seeing each other for a few months," he explained, as if this was perfectly normal information to spring on a 13-year-old girl, "and we have some exciting news." That exciting news was that they were getting married. Not only that, but Richard had a named Vanessa, who was 18 at the time. We would all be moving into Richard's larger house, in a more upscale neighborhood. Just like that, our family of 2 became a family of 4, and I was expected to be happy about it. From the beginning, Vanessa made it clear that she wasn't interested in having a little sister. She was preparing for college and considered me an annoying child who was invading her space. The first time I knocked on her bedroom door to introduce myself, she barely looked up from her magazine. "Look," she said, flipping a page, "let's just be clear about something. We're not going to be sisters. Our parents might be married, but that doesn't make us family. Stay out of my room and out of my business and, well, get along fine." I retreated to my new bedroom, which was larger than my old one but felt cold and unfamiliar. There were no dents in the walls from where Dad had hung my growth chart, no familiar stains on the carpet from art projects gone wrong. This wasn't home. It was just a house where I now lived. Richard wasn't cruel, but he never tried to be a father to me either. He was polite but distant, saving his real affection for Vanessa. When she announced she had been accepted to her college of choice, Richard threw an elaborate party with catered food and dozens of guests. When I won the science fair that same year, he nodded and said, "That's nice," before returning to his newspaper. What hurt most was watching Mom change. She had always been my champion, the one person who knew me better than anyone. But around Richard, she became someone different, more concerned with appearances, less patient with my questions and needs. When Richard criticized my table manners or my clothing choices, Mom would give me a look that said, "Just do what he says." When I tried to talk to her alone about how I was feeling, she would brush me off with, "We're all adjusting, Karen. Please try harder." Dinners in our new home were particularly tense. Richard would dominate the conversation, talking about his real estate business or Vanessa's accomplishments. If I tried to contribute, Richard would often interrupt or simply talk over me. Mom would give me small smiles of encouragement, but rarely spoke up on my behalf. The worst times were when I was alone with Vanessa. She had a talent for subtle cruelty, making cutting remarks when no one else could hear, accidentally breaking things that belonged to me, blaming me for things I hadn't done. Once she spilled soda on one of the few photo albums I had of my dad and me. When I confronted her, she shrugged and said it was an accident, but the smirk on her face told me otherwise. As the months passed, I noticed something concerning Richard seemed to be taking control of all the family finances, including the money Dad had left for me. There was a college fund that Dad had set up and a small inheritance that was supposed to be mine when I turned 18. When I overheard Richard discussing reinvesting those dormant funds with Mom, a knot formed in my stomach. But every time I tried to ask Mom about it, she would quickly change the subject. The once warm relationship between my mother and me had cooled to the point where we felt like distant relatives rather than mother and daughter. In my lonelier moments, I would take out the of Dad and try to remember what it felt like to be loved unconditionally. Those memories became a lifeline during the increasingly difficult days in what was supposed to be my home. By the time I turned 16, I had developed a survival strategy focused completely on school and planned my escape. I threw myself into my studies, joining every academic club I could and staying late at school to avoid coming home. My grades were exceptional, and my teachers often told me I had a bright future ahead. But at home, my achievements were met with indifference or worse, suspicion. "Why do you need to stay at school until 6 o'clock?" Richard would demand. "What are you really doing?" No amount of explanation about study groups or science club meetings seemed to satisfy him. Meanwhile, Vanessa had started college at a prestigious university, and every phone call home was treated like breaking news. Richard would gather us in the living room to hear about her latest party or the professor who had complimented her work. Mom would beam with pride while I sat silently invisible. I kept a journal during those years, pouring my thoughts and feelings onto its pages since I had no one to talk to. One entry from that time reads, "Sometimes I wonder if I would disappear completely. Would anyone in this house even notice I was gone?" My relationship with Mom had deteriorated to the point where our conversations were limited to practical matters. What time dinner would be, whether I needed new school supplies, reminders about chores. The mother who had once known my every thought and feeling now seemed like a stranger who happened to live in the same house. The real breaking point came during my junior year of high school. I was researching colleges and needed to know exactly how much money was available in my college fund. Dad had always talked about how he was saving for my education, and even though we weren't wealthy, I knew had put aside a significant amount. I gathered my courage and approached Richard one evening while he was working in his home office. I knocked on the doorframe, and he looked up with irritation. "What is it, Karen? I'm busy." "I wanted to ask about my college fund," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "the one my dad set up for me. I need to know how much is in it for planning purposes." Richard leaned back in his chair, a strange expression crossing his face. "That money has been reallocated," he said finally. "Reallocated? What does that mean?" "It means the money isn't there anymore. We needed it for Vanessa's tuition and some investments for the family. Your mother agreed to it." The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet, but that was my money. Dad left it specifically for my education. Richard's face hardened. "Listen carefully, Karen. While you live under my roof, you don't get to question my financial decisions. That money was used for this family, our family. The fact that you even bring this up shows how ungrateful you are for everything we provided for you." I stood there stunned into silence. Not only had they taken what was rightfully mine, but I was being called ungrateful for even asking about it. I turned and walked out of his office, my mind racing. I needed to talk to Mom. I found her in the kitchen preparing dinner. When I told her what Richard had said, I expected shock, outrage, some indication that this had been done without her knowledge. Instead, she sighed and avoided my eyes. "Richard knows what's best for our family finances, Karen. Vanessa's university is very expensive, and there were some business opportunities that needed investment. But that was Dad's money for me," I said, my voice breaking. "How could you let him take it?" "Don't be so dramatic," Mom said, her voice taking on that defensive tone she always used when discussing Richard. "You can get student loans like everyone else, or maybe consider community college." In that moment, I realized I was truly alone. My own mother had chosen her new family over me, had allowed them to steal what my father had worked so hard to provide for my future. It was the final betrayal. The next 2 years in that house were a special kind of hell. I became a ghost, coming and going, silently interacting as little as possible with Richard, Vanessa during her visits home, and even Mom. I worked part-time jobs, saving every penny I could, and applied for every scholarship available. My plan was simple: leave as soon as I graduated and never look back. During my senior year, Vanessa got engaged to Eric, a young businessman she had met at college. He came from money and had started his own company right after graduation. Richard was ecstatic, declaring Eric the son he never had. The wedding planning consumed the household, with Mom and Richard spending thousands of dollars on what Richard called the social event of the season. I was assigned various wedding tasks, running errands, addressing envelopes, picking up items from vendors, not because Vanessa wanted my help, but because Richard insisted I contribute to the family. During the actual wedding, I was seated at a table far from the family with distant relatives no one else wanted to deal with. When the photographer called for family photos, I was not included. The wedding was lavish and excessive, held at an exclusive country club with hundreds of guests. Vanessa looked beautiful in her designer gown, and Eric appeared every inch the successful businessman in his tailored tuxedo. As I watched them exchange vows, I couldn't help but wonder what my future would hold. Would anyone ever love me the way Eric seemed to love Vanessa? Would I ever feel like I belonged somewhere again? After the wedding, a new tradition began. Once a month the family would gather for dinner: my mother, Richard, Vanessa, and Eric. Sometimes extended family would join as well. Photos of these gatherings would appear on social media, everyone smiling and looking perfect. I was never invited. Not once in all those years did anyone think to include me in these family reunions. I would learn about them after the fact, seeing the pictures online or hearing Mom mention them in passing. Each time the message was clear: I was not considered part of the family. The day I graduated high school was bright and sunny, a perfect June morning. As I sat among my classmates in my cap and gown, I scanned the audience for familiar faces. My mother had promised to come, though Richard had a business obligation that day. As the ceremony progressed, I kept looking, hoping to see her somewhere in the crowd. She never arrived. After the ceremony, as other students celebrated with their families, I stood alone holding my diploma. Mrs. Henderson, my favorite English teacher, approached me with a warm smile. "Congratulations, Karen, highest GPA in the class. That is quite an achievement." "Thank you," I said, trying to keep the disappointment from my voice. Mrs. Henderson looked around. "Is no one here for you today?" I shrugged, attempting to appear nonchalant. They had other commitments. Something in her expression changed as she studied my face. "Walk with me for a moment, would you?" As we strolled across the emptying field, Mrs. Henderson told me she had been watching my academic progress for years and was impressed not just by my intelligence but by my determination. She had also noticed that I seemed to have little support at home. "I graduated from Westridge University," she said. "They have an excellent scholarship program for students like you. Bright, hard-working, and independent. The application deadline has passed, but I took the liberty of contacting my former professor who sits on the admissions committee. If you're interested, there's still a chance." That conversation changed the trajectory of my life. With Mrs. Henderson's guidance, I applied for the scholarship and was accepted to Westridge University with enough financial aid to cover most of my tuition. The housing and remaining expenses would be a challenge, but I was determined to make it work. When I returned home that day, I found my mother and Richard watching television in the living room. Neither asked about the graduation ceremony. "I got accepted to Westridge University," I announced, standing in the doorway. "I received a scholarship." Westridge. Richard scoffed without looking away from the television. "That's an expensive private school. Scholarship or not, you can't afford that." "I will be attending," I said firmly, "and I will be moving out next month." That got their attention. Mom looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else. "Guilt, perhaps. Moving out? Don't be ridiculous, Karen. Where would you go? How would you support yourself?" Her voice held a note of panic. "I've been saving for my jobs. I have enough for a security deposit on a shared apartment near campus. I've already found roommates, other students." The truth was, I had been planning this escape for over a year, meticulously saving and researching my options. Richard stood up, his face reddening. "This is absurd. You're not prepared to live on your own. You'll come crawling back within a month when you realize how difficult the real world is." "I already know how difficult the world is," I replied, surprised by my own calmness. "I've been living in a house where I'm treated like an unwelcome guest for 6 years. I think he'll manage." The argument that followed was ugly. Richard called me ungrateful, dramatic, foolish. Mom alternated between pleading with me to reconsider and defending Richard when I pointed out how I'd been treated. At one point, I asked directly about my college fund, and Richard stormed out of the room. The day I left, Mom helped me carry my bags to the car, an old Honda Civic ID purchased with my savings. As I prepared to drive away, she hugged me awkwardly. "The door is always open if you need to come back," she said, though her eyes darted toward the house where Richard waited. "Is it really, Mom?" I asked quietly. She had no answer for that. My first year at Westridge was incredibly difficult. I worked 2 part-time jobs while carrying a full course load. My apartment was shared with 3 other students in a rundown building far from campus, meaning long bus rides to and from classes. There were nights when I went to bed hungry because I had to choose between food and textbooks. I was exhausted, lonely, and sometimes wondered if Richard had been right about me failing on my own. But I didn't fail. Each semester, I earned top grades despite my challenging circumstances. I learned to budget every penny to find free resources on campus to survive on minimal sleep when necessary. And slowly, I began to build a new life for myself. The turning point came when I met Alexandra in my sophomore year. We were paired for a project in our computer science class, and her friendly, straightforward manner broke through the protective walls I'd built around myself. Alexandra came from a loving, supportive family and seemed genuinely baffled by my estrangement from mine. "Family is supposed to lift you up, not tear you down," she said, after I finally shared some of my story with her. "You deserved better, Karen." Those simple words of validation meant more to me than she could ever know. Alexandra became my first real friend in years, and eventually she introduced me to her family, who welcomed me warmly. Spending holidays with them showed me what a healthy family dynamic looked like, making the contrast with my own upbringing even more stark. During our junior year, I discovered my talent for developing mobile applications. What started as a class project evolved into something more as I recognized a gap in the market for an app that would help students manage their time and resources effectively. I spent countless hours coding and refining my idea, often working through the night after finishing my paid jobs and homework. "You should pursue this after graduation," Alexandra urged after seeing my prototype. "This could be huge, Karen. It's solving a real problem." When graduation approached, I was recruited by several tech companies offering competitive salaries and benefits. It was tempting. The security of a regular paycheck, health insurance, and stability was appealing after years of financial struggle. But my app concept had evolved into a comprehensive platform, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see it through. In a decision that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure, I declined the job offers and committed to launching my own company. Alexandra thought I was brave. Others thought I was crazy. But for the first time in my life, I was making a choice purely for myself, based on my own vision and desires. Whatever the outcome, that alone felt like victory. The first year after graduation was a blur of 18-hour days, instant ramen, and moments of alternating elation and despair. I had rented a tiny studio apartment that doubled as my office, sleeping on a futon that I folded up each morning to make space for my work. My savings were dwindling rapidly, but I was making progress on the app development. The breakthrough came when I presented my prototype at a local tech meetup. After my demonstration, a man approached me, introduced himself as Daniel Ramirez, and handed me his business card. He was an angel investor looking for promising startups, and something about my presentation had caught his attention. "Your concept is solid," he said during our first official meeting, "but what impressed me most was your understanding of the user experience. You clearly know your target audience because you've lived their challenges." Daniel offered to invest $50,000 in exchange for a 20% stake in my company. It wasn't a huge amount by tech startup standards, but it was enough to keep me afloat while I refined the product and prepared for launch. More importantly, Daniel became a mentor, guiding me through the business aspects I was less familiar with and introducing me to his network of industry contacts. The app launched 6 months later, and the response exceeded my wildest expectations. College students across the country downloaded it, and positive reviews poured in. Revenue from the premium version allowed me to hire my first employees, a developer, to help with updates and new features, and a marketing specialist to expand our reach. By the end of the second year, we had expanded to a proper office space and a team of 12 people. Managing others was a new challenge for me. I had never seen myself as a leader, but I discovered that my experiences had given me valuable insights. I knew how it felt to be dismissed and undervalued, so I created a company culture where every voice was heard and respected. I understood financial insecurity, so I ensured fair compensation and benefits for my team. As the company grew, so did the challenges. There were competitors who tried to copy our technical issues that required all-night problem-solving sessions and the constant pressure to innovate and stay relevant. But through it all, I found that I thrived under pressure. The girl who had once felt invisible was now making decisions that affected dozens of employees and thousands of users. 5 years after leaving my mother's house, I sold my company to a larger tech firm for a sum that still seems unreal when I think about it. I stayed on as CEO, maintaining creative control while gaining the resources to expand our reach globally. Overnight, I went from comfortably well off to wealthy, beyond anything I could have imagined as that lonely teenager planning her escape. One of the first things I did with my new financial freedom was purchase my dream home, a modern beachfront property with floor-to-ceiling windows that filled every room with light and the constant sound of waves. The house was probably excessive for one person with its 5 bedrooms and expansive open living spaces, but after years of cramped apartments and shared housing, I wanted space that was entirely mine. Standing on the deck overlooking the ocean that first evening, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in what it accomplished, certainly, but also a lingering sadness for the family connections I had lost, or, more accurately, never really had. Success was sweet, but it couldn't fill the void left by years of rejection and isolation. That realization led me to seek therapy, something I'd resisted, despite Alexandra's gentle suggestions over the years. I had always prided myself on my self-sufficiency, viewing the need for help as weakness, but now I understood that healing from my past was necessary if I wanted to fully enjoy my present and future. Dr. Marilyn Weber, my therapist, helped me process the abandonment and betrayal I'd experienced. "What happened wasn't your fault," she told me during one particularly difficult session. "You were a child who deserved protection and support. The adults in your life failed you, not the other way around." Gradually, I learned to separate my self-worth from my family's treatment of me. I recognized that their behavior reflected their own limitations and flaws, not my value as a person. This understanding didn't erase the pain, but it made it more manageable. As part of my healing process, I established a scholarship foundation for students from difficult family backgrounds. The Karen Taylor Foundation provided not just financial assistance, but also mentoring and emotional support for young people who, like me, were trying to build lives without family backing. Working with these students gave purpose to my pain and reminded me that even the most difficult experiences could be transformed into something positive. Throughout these years of growth and success, my relationship with my family remained non-existent. I sent Christmas and birthday cards to my mother each year, usually receiving a brief text message in return. Occasionally, I would see social media posts about family gatherings, Richard and Mom celebrating their anniversary, Vanessa and Eric buying a new home, holiday celebrations that looked perfect in filtered photos. I was never invited to any of these events, never included in what they considered family. Sometimes, late at night, I would wonder what they thought had become of me. Did they ever worry? Did they ever regret the way they'd treated me? Or was I simply a chapter they had closed, a person they preferred to forget? I had no answers to these questions, and most days I convinced myself I no longer cared. But deep down there remained a small, wounded part of me that still yearned for the family it never truly had. That part of me watched the happy families at the beach near my home with a mixture of warmth and wistfulness. That part of me sometimes dreamed of reconciliation, of healing, of being welcomed with open arms by the people who should have loved me all along. That was the part of me that felt a jolt of recognition when 12 years after I had left home, I heard the doorbell ring on a quiet Sunday afternoon and opened the door to find them standing there, my mother, Richard, Vanessa and Eric, looking both familiar and like strangers all at once. The doorbell echoed through my house, peaceful Sunday afternoon of reading on my deck. I wasn't expecting anyone and few people knew where I lived. I valued my privacy and kept my address confidential. Curious and slightly annoyed, I made my way to the front door, tucking my hair behind my ears and straightening my casual sweater. Nothing could have prepared me for the sight that greeted me when I opened the door. There they stood like apparitions from another life, my mother, Richard, Vanessa and Eric. For a moment, I thought I might be hallucinating, that perhaps I'd fallen asleep while reading, and this was some strange dream conjured by my subconscious. My mother looked older than her 62 years, her once vibrant brown hair, now gray and cut in a severe bob. She wore an expensive-looking outfit that seemed at odds with the anxiety in her eyes. Richard stood beside her, still tall but no longer imposing. His confident posture had been replaced by a slight stoop, and the hair that he had once meticulously styled was thin and receding. Vanessa, now 36, had maintained her polished appearance, though her designer clothes couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders and the tight lines around her mouth. Eric stood slightly apart from the others, his expression unreadable behind a forced smile. "Karen," my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper, "it's been so long." I stood frozen in the doorway, 1,000 emotions rushing through me at once. Shock, confusion, anger, curiosity, all competing for dominance. But years of business negotiations had taught me to maintain my composure in unexpected situations. "Yes," I replied evenly. 12 years to be exact. An uncomfortable silence followed as they seemed to wait for me to say more, to ask why they were there, perhaps, or to express joy at seeing them. I did neither, simply waiting with one hand still on the door. Finally Richard cleared his throat. "This is quite a home you have here. The neighborhood is very exclusive. Would you like to come in?" I asked, not out of warmth, but because standing in the doorway felt awkward, and I preferred to understand the purpose of this unexpected visit sooner rather than later. They filed past me into the foyer, their eyes widening as they took in the soaring ceilings, the marble floors, the glass walls revealing the ocean view. I led them to the living room, gesturing for them to sit on the sectional sofa while I took a chair opposite them. "Can I offer you something to drink, water, coffee, tea?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, formal and detached, as if I were hosting business associates rather than family. "Water's fine, thank you," my mother said, and the others nodded in agreement. I went to the kitchen, grateful for a moment alone to collect my thoughts. As I filled glasses with filtered water and arranged them on a tray, I took several deep breaths. Whatever their reason for appearing after all these years, I would not allow them to see how much their presence affected me. I would not give them that power. When I returned, I found them huddled in conversation that abruptly ceased as I entered. I distributed the water and resumed my seat, crossing my legs and meeting their gazes directly. So I said, "What brings you here after all this time? And how did you find my address?" My mother and Richard exchanged glances before she answered. "We saw an article about you in Business Insider. It mentioned you lived in this area, and we hired someone to find the exact address." She at least had the grace to look embarrassed about this admission. "That was resourceful," I replied, my tone neutral. "You've done very well for yourself," Vanessa interjected, gesturing to the room around us. "Your company is quite successful from what we've read." "It is," I agreed. "Though I'm surprised you've been following my career." Another uncomfortable silence fell. I sipped my water and waited. They had sought me out. Let them explain why. "Karen," my mother finally said, leaning forward, "we wanted to reconnect. It's been too long, and we're family after all." "Family," I repeated, the feeling foreign on my tongue. "That's an interesting choice of word." Richard shifted in his seat. "We know things weren't always easy when you were growing up, but that's in the past now. We're hoping we can move forward." I studied him, noting the sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the comfortable temperature in the room. "Move forward," I echoed. "And what does that look like to you, Richard?" The conversation continued in this strained manner for nearly an hour. They asked superficial questions about my life, my work, my home. I answered politely, but offered no details beyond what they specifically asked. They shared equally superficial updates about their lives. Vanessa and Eric's 10th wedding anniversary, my mother's retirement from teaching. Richard scaled back involvement in his real estate business. What they didn't mention was the 12 years of silence, the family gatherings I hadn't been invited to, the major life events they hadn't shared with me, the complete absence of any attempt to contact me until now. We danced around these glaring omissions, maintaining a facade of civility that grew more strained with each passing minute. It was when I offered to show them the deck overlooking the ocean that the real purpose of their visit began to emerge. As we stood admiring the view, Eric casually mentioned his new business venture, a tech startup that was showing great promise but needed additional investment. "The timing of the market hasn't been ideal," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than meeting mine. "We're in a bit of a cash flow situation, temporarily, of course." "That sounds challenging," I replied, deliberately obtuse. Vanessa placed a hand on her stomach, a gesture I hadn't noticed earlier. "We're expecting our first child," she announced, her voice softening, "for the first time since they arrived, due in 4 months." "Congratulations," I said genuinely, meaning it, despite everything. A child deserved only good wishes, regardless of its parents. "Yes, it's wonderful news," Richard interjected, "but it's put some additional pressure on their finances, and well, with the market downturn affecting my retirement portfolio and your mother's pension being less than we anticipated." I turned away from the view to face them directly. "Are you asking me for money?" The bluntness of my question seemed to startle them. My mother looked down at her hands. Vanessa flushed, and Eric became suddenly interested in his shoes. Only Richard attempted to maintain his composure. "Not asking exactly," he said, his voice taking on the smooth tone I remembered from my youth, the one he used when trying to convince someone of something, more like exploring opportunities for family to support each other, perhaps an investment in Eric's company, or a loan to help Vanessa and Eric prepare for the baby. "A loan," I repeated. "And how much were you thinking would be appropriate for family to support each other?" Richard named a sum that would have seemed enormous to the 18-year-old, who left home with nothing but relatively insignificant to me now. What was significant was the audacity of the request itself, the assumption that they could appear after 12 years of silence and expect financial assistance. "I see," I said, my voice steady, despite the anger building inside me. "And this is why you've sought me out after all this time, because you need money." No, my mother hurried to say. "We genuinely wanted to reconnect. The financial situation is just a separate issue." "Is it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because in 12 years there have been no calls, no visits, no invitations to family events. Not even when I set my address and phone number with every Christmas card. But now that you need money, suddenly family is important again." The atmosphere on the deck shifted tension, thickening the air between us. Richard straightened his shoulders, preparing for the kind of confrontation he had always dominated in the past. "Now, Karen," he began, his tone condescending. "There's no need to be dramatic. Families sometimes drift apart, but blood is still blood." I looked at him for a long moment, then turned to walk back into the house. "I think we should continue this conversation inside," I said over my shoulder. As they followed me back to the living room, I could feel the weight of unspoken words of years of hurt and resentment pressing down on all of us. The time for polite evasion had passed. Now we would finally speak the truth, whether they wanted to hear it or not. Once we were all seated again in the living room, I excused myself briefly. "Give me a moment," I said, rising from my chair. I need to get something. I walked to my home office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, and removed a large manila envelope that I had kept for years. Inside were all the Christmas cards, birthday cards, and brief letters I had sent to my mother over the 12 years since I had left home. Each one returned unopened, marked return to sender. Each one a rejection I had never shared with anyone, not even Alexandra or my therapist. I returned to the living room and placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. No one moved to touch it. Do you know what these are? I asked, my voice, soft but clear. When no one answered, I continued. These are the cards and letters I sent every year. For 12 years, I reached out on birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days, when I simply missed having a family. For 12 years, they came back unopened. My mother's face paled. I never received any cards, she said, her voice trembling. I turned to Richard, whose expression had hardened. Did you intercept my mother's mail, Richard? His silence was answer enough. I also have something else to show you, I said, picking up my tablet from a side table. I opened my email and turned the screen toward them. These are the emails I sent, all marked as read but never answered, and these, I continued scrolling through my phone, are the text messages that were delivered but ignored. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. Karen, the past is the past. We're trying to move forward now. Are you? I asked, looking directly at her, or are you here because you need something from me? The room fell silent again. The only sound, the distant crash of waves against the shore outside. In that moment I felt a strange calm descend over me. The anger and hurt were still there, but they no longer controlled me. I had built a life for myself, despite their rejection. I had found success, friendship, and a measure of peace. Their opinion of me no longer determined my worth. Let me ask you something, I said, breaking the silence. If I had failed instead of succeeded, if I were struggling financially instead of wealthy, would you be sitting in my living room right now? Would you have tracked down my address and shown up at my door talking about the importance of family? The color drained from their faces as I spoke these words, the truth of them hanging in the air between us. Richard was the first to recover. That's not fair, Karen. We've had our own struggles. Maybe we didn't handle everything perfectly with you, but we did the best we could with the circumstances we had. Did you? I countered. Was taking my college fund doing your best? Was excluding me from family gatherings doing your best? Was returning my letters unopened doing your best? We were going through difficult times financially, Richard insisted, his voice rising defensively. Vanessa's education was expensive, and there were investments that didn't pan out as expected. We had to make hard choices, and those choices always seemed to come at my expense, I said calmly. Always. Vanessa's eyes had filled with tears. We're family, Karen. Despite everything, we're still family. I looked at her for a long moment. Family isn't just a word you can invoke when it's convenient, Vanessa. Family is shown through actions, consistent, loving actions over time. Where was this concern for family when I graduated high school alone? Or when I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college? Or when I launched my company and was living on ramen noodles and 4 hours of sleep a night? My mother had remained silent throughout this exchange, her eyes fixed on the envelope of returned letters. Finally, she looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know about the letters or the emails. I thought you had simply cut us out of your life. Part of me wanted to believe her, but I had learned to be cautious with hope. Even if that's true, Mom, you never tried to reach out either. You knew where I went to college. You could have found me if you'd wanted to. She had no response to that, her gaze dropping back to her hands. Eric, who had been quiet throughout most of the visit, finally spoke up. Look, Karen, we obviously approached this all wrong. We should have been honest from the start about our situation. The business is in trouble, serious trouble. We're at risk of losing everything. The house, the cars, our savings. The baby is coming, and we're scared. His honesty, at least, I could appreciate. Thank you for being straightforward, Eric. Richard, seeing an opening, leaned forward eagerly. So you'll help us, a loan or perhaps an investment in Eric's company. With your business acumen and financial resources, it would be beneficial for everyone. I shook my head slowly. No, Richard, I will not be giving you money. The hope that had begun to build in their expressions crashed, replaced by a mixture of disappointment and, in Richard's case, anger. After all this talk about family, you're going to turn your back on us when we need help, he demanded. I'm not turning my back on anyone, I replied steadily. But I'm also not going to pretend the past didn't happen, or that your sudden interest in reconnecting isn't directly tied to your financial problems. I looked at each of them in turn as I continued. What I will offer is this. If you're genuinely interested in rebuilding a relationship, we can start slowly. Get to know each other as the adults we are now, not the people we were 12 years ago. And if Eric is serious about his business, I'm willing to review his business plan and offer guidance, connections, or mentorship, but not money. Not yet. Trust and relationships have to be earned, not bought. Richard stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. We came here in good faith, and you're treating us like we're trying to scam you. No, I said, remaining seated and calm. I'm treating you like people who have hurt me deeply in the past and have yet to acknowledge that hurt, let alone apologize for it. I'm setting boundaries based on our history together. That's not ridiculous, it's self-respect. My mother reached out to place a hand on Richard's arm, urging him to sit back down. He shrugged her off, but remained standing, his face flushed with anger. We should go, he said tersely. Clearly, this was a mistake. Vanessa looked torn, her gaze moving between her father and me. Dad, maybe we should listen to what Karen is offering. Some guidance for Eric's business could be valuable. We don't need her guidance, Richard snapped. We need actual help, not condescending lectures about the past. My mother stood now too, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resignation. Karen, I'm sorry for everything. I should have been a better mother to you. I should have protected you and supported you. I failed you, and I can never make that right. Her words spoken with genuine remorse touched something deep within me. For years, I had longed to hear her acknowledge what had happened to validate the pain I had carried. It wasn't enough to heal everything, but it was a start. Thank you for saying that, Mom, I said softly. Richard made a disgusted sound and headed for the door. Eric followed after a moment's hesitation, pausing, only to say, I'll call you about that business plan review if that's still on the table. I nodded, and he continued after his father-in-law. Vanessa lingered, clearly conflicted. I never hated you, she said suddenly. I was jealous, I think. Dad always talked about how brilliant you were even when he was being hard on you, and I felt threatened when you came into our family. It was wrong, and I'm sorry too. Her admission surprised me. I had never imagined that Richard had said anything positive about me, let alone that Vanessa might have felt threatened by me. Thank you for telling me that, I said. It helps me understand some things better. She nodded awkwardly, then followed the men outside. My mother was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at me. Can I call you sometime? She asked, her voice small. Yes, I replied. I'd like that. As their car pulled away from my house, I stood in the doorway watching until they were out of sight. The encounter had been draining, but also cathartic in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in 12 years, I had spoken my truth to them, without fear or shame. I had set boundaries without apology. And perhaps most importantly, I had offered a path forward, one based on honesty and respect rather than obligation or financial need. Whether they would take that path remained to be seen, but regardless of their choice, I knew I would be okay. I had built a life I was proud of, surrounded myself with people who valued me and found strength I never knew I possessed. That was something no one could take away from me. Not even the family who had once made me feel I was worth nothing at all. After they left, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of the encounter in every part of my body. The house that had always been my sanctuary suddenly felt too large, too empty. I moved to my deck and sat watching the waves crash against the shore, letting the rhythm of the ocean calm my racing thoughts. When the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the water, I picked up my phone and called Alexandra. She answered on the second ring. You'll never believe who just left my house, I said without preamble. As I recounted the visit, Alexandra listened without interrupting, though I could hear her occasional sharp intake of breath or murmur of disbelief. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. How are you feeling? She finally asked, her voice gentle. It was a simple question, but I had to think about my answer. Shaken, I admitted. Angry, sad, but also relieved, in a way. Like I've finally spoken all the words I've been carrying around for years. I'm proud of you, Alexandra said. Setting boundaries like that couldn't have been easy, especially with your mom apologizing. It wasn't, I agreed. Part of me wanted to just give them the money and be done with it. Another part wanted to throw them out the moment I realized why they were really there. Finding the middle ground was hard. But you did it, she pointed out. And that's growth, Karen. The girl I met in college might have done one of those extremes, but the woman you've become knew there was another way. Her words stayed with me in the days and weeks that followed. I had changed, evolved into someone stronger and more balanced than the wounded girl who had left home at 18. That growth hadn't come easily. It had required years of hard work, therapy, friendship, and conscious choices to break old patterns. For the first month after their visit, I heard nothing from any of them. I wasn't surprised. Richard had always been proud, and my refusal to simply hand over money must have stung. I wondered occasionally about my mother, whether she had meant what she said or if her apology had been another attempt to manipulate me. I tried not to dwell on these thoughts, focusing instead on my work and the Scholarship Foundation, which was preparing to announce its newest recipients. Then 6 weeks after their visit, I received an email from my mother. It was brief but heartfelt, apologizing again for the past and asking if we could talk by phone sometime. I responded with my number and suggested a time later that week. Our first conversation was awkward, filled with long pauses and careful words, but it was a start. We agreed to talk again the following week, and slowly a pattern emerged. Our weekly calls became a fixture in both our lives, a chance to cautiously build something new from the ashes of our former relationship. During one of these calls 3 months after her visit, my mother revealed that she and Richard were seeing a marriage counselor. "Things haven't been good between us for years," she admitted. "I think I've been afraid to acknowledge how unhappy I've been, afraid of being alone again, like after your father died." It was the first time she had mentioned my father in years, and the reference opened a door to conversations about him, about the happy years before his death, about memories I had feared were mine alone. These shared recollections became a bridge between us, connecting our present to a past that hadn't been entirely painful. Around the same time, I received a surprise email from Eric. Despite Richard's anger, he had taken me up on my offer to review his business plan. The document he sent was actually quite solid. His idea had merit, but his execution and financial planning needed work. I spent a weekend annotating the plan with suggestions and questions, then sent it back with an offer to connect him with some contacts in the industry who might provide guidance. His grateful response led to a series of professional exchanges that gradually became more personal. Through Eric, I learned that Vanessa had given birth to a baby girl they had named Lily. He sent a photo of the infant, tiny and perfect in her hospital blanket. I sent a gift basket but maintained my boundaries, making it clear that while I was open to rebuilding relationships, I wouldn't be providing the financial bailout they had initially sought. Richard remained distant, refusing to speak to me during my calls with my mother and declining to attend when she suggested meeting for lunch during one of my business trips to their city. His pride, it seemed, would not allow him to accept the new terms of our relationship. I found that I could live with this. Some wounds were perhaps too deep to heal, some bridges burned beyond repair. What surprised me most during this period of cautious reconciliation was how my own feelings evolved. The anger that had once burned so hot within me gradually cooled, replaced by a kind of detached compassion. I could see now that Richard's controlling behavior likely stemmed from his own insecurities, that my mother's failure to protect me was rooted in her fear of being alone, that Vanessa's cruelty had been born of jealousy and her own need for validation. Understanding these dynamics didn't excuse their actions, but it helped me contextualize them. They were flawed people who had made harmful choices, not monsters who had set out to destroy me. This realization didn't make the past hurt less, but it did make the weight of it easier to carry. 6 months after their unexpected appearance at my door, I expanded the Karen Taylor Foundation to include a new program specifically designed to help young adults aging out of foster care or leaving difficult family situations. The program provided not just financial support, but also mentoring, life skills training, and therapy. Working with these young people, hearing their stories, and witnessing their resilience brought healing I hadn't known I still needed. During the Foundation's annual gala, I shared parts of my own story publicly for the first time. Standing at the podium, looking out at the faces of donors, scholarship recipients, and community partners, I spoke about the pain of family rejection, the struggle to build a life without support, and the journey toward healing and success. "The most profound lesson I've learned," I told the audience, "is that forgiveness isn't something you do for others. It's something you do for yourself." Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing harmful behavior. It means releasing the hold that behavior has on your present and future. I paused, looking around the room at the young people whose lives the Foundation was helping to transform. And perhaps even more importantly, I've learned that family isn't just about blood or legal ties. Family is about who shows up for you, who celebrates your victories, and supports you through defeats. Family is about consistency, respect, and love in action, not just in words. After the gala, as I was saying goodbye to guests, I was surprised to see my mother waiting quietly near the exit. She had not told me she was coming, but there she was, her eyes red from crying during my speech. "I'm so proud of you, Karen," she said when I reached her. "Not just for your success, but for who you've become despite everything." Despite us, we embraced. And in that moment, I felt something shift within me, a piece of my heart that had remained guarded, relaxing its vigilance just a little. The road ahead would not be easy. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Relationships, once damaged, require care and intention to heal. There would be setbacks and difficult conversations, old hurts resurfacing, and new boundaries being